Hello, my name is John Bell, and welcome to our Summer 2020 Online Puppet Forum, number 13, lucky 13. We are sorry we had to cancel the forum scheduled for last week with Raphael Fleury, but maybe we'll do more of these. The online puppet forums are a series, or have been a series, and wait a second, I'm going to, there is a series of attempts for us to think about all sorts of important issues related to puppetry and puppet history, and something we've been calling puppetry studies. I want to thank at this moment my colleague Emily Wicks, the manager of collections and operations at the Ballard Institute, for standing by backstage, as it were, and helping out with the technical aspects of all of these forums, and as well as doing so many other things. As you may know, we kind of switched all of our programming since mid-March, 5-6 months ago, to online platforms, including all sorts of puppet workshops that our student workers, Elise Van Ness and Felicia Cooper, have been doing. We're going to continue doing online programming, not every week in terms of the forums and the workshops, but more along our monthly schedule that we usually do, these forums and workshops. Let's see, we're doing a puppet slam coming up in September, and an online pageant for Celebrate Mansfield, and about women's suffrage. But I digress, because we want to welcome our guest, Dr. Dassia Posner, who is in Chicago, and whose image is right there with her new web camera. Greetings, Dassia. Thank you for joining us today. It looks sunny in Chicago.
It is sunny in Chicago, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation.
Big pleasure. Dassia, let's see if I said everything I needed to say beforehand. Dassia is a theater historian at Northwestern University, specializing in Russian avant-garde theater, the history of directing, production, dramaturgy, and world puppetry history and performance. She teaches undergraduate courses in theater and Slavic languages and literature, and also graduate courses in the MFA in directing and interdisciplinary PhD in theater and drama at Northwestern. She's currently the director of interdisciplinary PhD in theater and drama, and vice president for awards of the Association for Theater and Higher Education. Awesome. And Dassia, who I've been lucky enough to know for a long time, has been really been quite productive with her writing, and received a lot of awards for her writing and her books, including The Director's Prism, E.T.A. Hoffman, and the Russian Theatrical Avant-Garde. Very interesting. And the Rutledge Companion to Puppetry and Material Performance, which she co-edited with Claudia Orenstein, one of our earlier guests, and myself. That was a wonderful project I got to be part of. And also Three Loves for Three Oranges, Gotzi, Meyerholt, and Prokofiev, co-edited with, well, this is a new one, Kevin Bartig and associate editor Maria Di Simone, which is forthcoming, as we say. And she's also the author of many articles about different aspects of theater. Her web-based archive companion to the Director's Prism, which is a great feature, features over 100 multimedia Russian theater sources. And I guess we could post the URL for that online. Maybe my colleague Emily could do that. And Dassia's current book in progress is The Moscow Kamerny Theater, an Artistic History in Political Times, which is looking at the Kamerny Theater's innovations and international influence in the artistic and political context of the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s. So awesome, welcome. as you can tell, dear audience, Dassia's work covers a wide range of theater, not only puppet theater, but puppet theater is an essential aspect of that. And I'm very excited about the conversation we're about to have. But first, I wanted to ask Dassia about how you became interested in puppetry and then in theater history, and how did the puppetry and the theater history combine?
Great. I'm going to take just a second to turn my video off and then on again, see if you can get me in a little bit better focus, and then I will be thrilled to answer that question. All right, let's see if we're a little better now. Is that better?
I think it's about the same.
It's about the same. Okay, I'll just lean a little closer then. All right. So, so John, you know a lot of this back history because you were part of so much of it.
Yep.
When I was a junior in college, I studied at the Moscow Art Theater for a year, and I saw a lot of productions that were really exciting in terms of the visual language. It was something that I hadn't encountered before. I hadn't actually been to a lot of theater. I had been in a lot of theater before that. And then when I returned to the United States, I was lucky enough that at my college, there was a new professor, Amy Trumpeter, longtime Bread and Puppeteer member, whom you've known for your whole career. And she introduced me to puppet opera. She introduced me to puppets as this visual language. And it was really exciting for me. And so, Emily, if you could go to that first slide, what I'll show you is a little bit of that early work, which I ended up really loving the giant puppet work. And so I was invited to do a couple of workshops at the Alice Ferguson Foundation in Accokeek, Maryland. We did some outdoor pageants. I worked with Sarah Peedy and the Puppeteers Cooperative for years and years, something like 20 years. I worked on the first night parade in Boston. And then also I felt like that wasn't enough because for giant puppet work, you need so many people for all the work. And so I founded a shadow company with varying company members, Vlada Tomova, Bonnie Duncan, Hannah Dahlman, Hannah Dahlman, Lilia Livitina, and even Will Cabell for a little while.
Sure.
And
this is all in the Boston area. Excuse me, I interrupted you.
Yeah, this is all in the Boston area. And we did adaptations of Eastern European tales in a combination of languages, Russian, Bulgarian, and English. We can go back to our faces now. Then from there, I became really interested in trying to discover how I could learn more, because I felt like at some point there was so much exciting work out there, but I didn't know how to find it. So I felt like I was spinning my wheels a little bit. So the first thing I did was I went to Russia for a month and a half to just go around and look at puppet theaters there. Let me show you a puppet that I was given.
Great.
This is a puppet from Central Russia, from the city of Kazan. And she's very beautifully articulated. Her mouth moves, her eyes blink. Yeah, she was a gift from one of the puppet companies there. And so that was really exciting for me. And I thought, well, what could I learn in terms of history as well? And so I ended up going to graduate school, and I was lucky enough to have Lawrence Senelik as my mentor. And he's one of those very few people in the world who's passionate about popular entertainment and Russian theater. I went in on the very first day with a copy of Nina Efimova's Adventures of a Russian Puppet Theater, and said, I'd like to translate this as a master's thesis, and he didn't laugh. And it turned into a beautiful relationship from there. Yeah,
that Senelik is so interesting because as you point out, your image got clearer. Because as you said, he's so interested in popular theater. And for those of us interested in puppetry, it's always kind of trying to find a way into the larger field of theater history. So cool, awesome. Then what happened?
Then I ended up getting a PhD
Right.
which was a complete surprise to me. I ended up first writing about Russian women puppetry pioneers,
Right.
which was very exciting for me. And then I ended up sort of trying to see how those same puppet principles in terms of emphasis on fantasy and emphasis on form and real interest in materials and on defining the theater's fundamental laws had become a larger part of Russian culture. Yeah. And then that was what really spawned my interest in Russian directors.
But for me too, when I realized I followed a somewhat similar path by being involved with puppetry for a while and then wanting to find more about it and looking at modern or modernist puppetry, and for me realizing that Russian art and Russian performance, Russian theater, Russian puppet theater is so central to that, and actually a sort of crucible of it at an early moment from the 1890s, and then through the symbolists and the Russian futurists and the constructivists, all the way through the revolution into the triumph of socialist realism. But Russia's super strong puppet traditions have this interesting connection to modernism, which seems so central to like 20th century puppetry, that mixture of the real old ritual-based puppetry and then totally modernist ideas that in Russia's case are wrapped up with the Bolshevik revolution. So I wondered what was about your sense of the importance of puppetry to Russian culture. How did you come to think of that?
That's a great question, and I'm really glad that you specifically mentioned that sort of collision of the old and new, or marriage or fusion or juxtaposition of the old and new, because I think that's really important in Russian culture, this sort of dance between looking back to history and then also reinventing it at the same time. So what I want to do is I want to talk about a couple of forms. We'll go to the next slide. And what we're looking at here is vertep and Petrushka. And these are the two native Russian puppetry forms. Vertep is, 1700s on, is based on the nativity story. It has two levels. You have the angels and the wise men and the Holy Family upstairs, and then you have Herod and the massacre of the innocents on the lower level. It was carried around from house to house at Christmas time. So that's one traditional form. The other one is Petrushka, which was often played at fairgrounds, Russian fairgrounds, which were featured before Lent and before Easter. And, big temporary celebrations that had a number of different kinds of performances, including pantomimes and trained bear shows and ice slides and peep shows that were kind of like little panopticons. And Petrushka players, which, Petrushka is like the Russian Punch and Judy. Petrushka players would perform at these fairs. Let's go back to, we can end this slide. And what we're going to watch two videos now, because what you'll have noticed from that slide is that there was a historical image and a contemporary image for each one. And there's a company that I very much admire because they, to me, really exemplify what it is to take old traditions and to find new life in them. And John, you're familiar with this company because you also brought them to UConn. Sure. Vagrant Booth Theater, Alexander Greff and Nina Efimova and Dassia Posner, and they've done really fascinating and really poetic, beautiful revivals of both Vertep and Petrushka. So what I want to do is I want to just show you a little bit of video of their work so you really understand what these native forms were that some of the Russian modernist artists were drawing from. So we can go ahead and watch part of the Vertep.
Где Христос родися, там звезда явися.
Святое семейство и ангелы.
Ангел им являет, на путь наставляет. Идите,
So what you see here is you see these really simple puppets. There's no attempt at realism here. Beautiful retelling of a familiar story, entirely lit by candles. And there's wonderful tricks as well, such as death comes and cuts off Herod's head. And when Herod is taken down to hell in a trapdoor, then there's this poof of fire that's absolutely glorious. So that's one of the forms that Russian artists were drawing from. Less so after the revolution because of its religious content, but the form that you do see being used again and again is Petrushka. So what we're going to do is we're going to then now also look at a little bit of video of Petrushka. This again is Vagrant Booth's version of Petrushka. Is a very beautifully swazzled Petrushka. Right. And they have very much kept they've very much honored the street tradition of Petrushka performance. This is them performing, we're going to watch a video of them performing Covent Garden. And notice also the rhythmical nature of their work.
Dassia, before Emily plays that, maybe you should explain what a swazzle is for those happily uninitiated.
I would love to explain what a swazzle is, but first listen. All right, so what you see here is you see Petrushka beating the doctor with a slapstick, and you hear three things, right? You hear Petrushka's voice, which is this very high-pitched voice. That voice is made with a swazzle. It's a tiny little wind instrument that sits in your mouth between the soft and the hard palate, and it has a membrane in the middle, and if you speak through it, it makes that high noise. It's kind of like a kazoo, except that you don't have to use your vocal cords at all. So that's number one. Number two, as you can see, they use the slapsticks as a percussion instrument. And so you get this real sense of rhythm being the driving force of the story. And then number three, the bottler in the English tradition is called the musician, muzikant, in the Russian tradition. And he's playing the hurdy-gurdy, and he's interacting with the puppets and sort of explaining the puppets and speaking for the puppets and framing the story of the puppets as they perform.
And I'm so glad you showed this really fascinating film of Vagrant Booth performing. I just wanted to note, when we were talking with Frank Proshin about performing objects, the whole semiotics of this vocal sound of the swazzle, which is known in under different names in Asia and in all over Europe, is really interesting aspect of the analyzing what exactly puppet theater does. And how it communicates through sound, kind of more than words. And the other thing that's so beautiful about that, the clip you just showed us, is what I think of as the choreography and the music, the way that the puppets are, it's really a dance piece or a martial arts combat piece with very strong rhythm, and then that percussive sound of the slapstick. And I find that to be really enlightening about what makes puppets work. It's not so much talking, but it's this complicated choreography and music.
That's right. And I think that this kind of work, I mean, you see elements of it in both forms, but Petrushka was more sort of actively adopted by Russian modernists. One of the reasons that they thought that this form was so potentially valuable, I mean, there were all of those turn of the century worries about, death and fate and being pulled by the strings of fate. So there's all that sort of typical marionette metaphor stuff happening that you see happening elsewhere in Europe as well. Right. But specifically the fact that the puppet theater has such clear laws, and that those laws are based in creation,
Okay.
rather than in imitating reality, and that you can think about things like form and rhythm and self-referentiality.
Right.
And that those were the sort of elements, I think, that became really interesting to Russian modernists who themselves were interested in experimenting with form, and who also lamented the slow dying out of the Russian Fairground and wanted to find a way of keeping some of those traditions alive.
I wanted to just interject that throughout this whole series of forums, especially the forums focused on puppet theater in Asia, but not only that, we've talked about the importance of ritual performance, or the function of puppetry as ritual and performance that has religious significance, to Wayang and Chinese theater and theater from all over the place. And you see that right here, especially with Vertep, with the way it's reiterating the story of the birth of Jesus and the nativity story in a fascinating and exciting way. So I like the way, I like to think about the way that the ritual roots of puppetry are persistent wherever. And then you were just talking about the way that modernists, who are, by the way, also interested in ritual in the sense that a lot of semiotic studies before Prague School that Frank Proshin talked about so much, excuse me for going on, begin in Moscow, and people are interested in these ritual roots of Russian culture. But you're starting to talk about modernism's interest in form, which I think is super fascinating.
I want to pull in a question by Carol Sterling that just appeared in the chat, because I think it's really relevant to what I wanted to say next, which is, Carol Sterling wanted to know, what is the current status of puppetry arts in Russia today? Well, because of this early interest in puppetry, it started out as more of a theoretical interest, people using puppet themes in their work. But then some puppeteers, especially early on, women puppeteers, started to create theaters that merged the street elements with artistic, high art painting elements, so that they were bringing puppets to different kinds of audiences. And that was when the first theaters for youth were founded. That was when you started having puppetry performances at art exhibits and in artistic cabarets and things like that. And after the revolution, theater was viewed immediately, after the 1917 Bolshevik Revolution, theater was viewed pretty much immediately as a necessary tool for bringing education and enlightenment to the Russian people, which at that time was something like 80% illiterate. And so puppetry was an educational tool, but it was also like a cultural tool. And so at that time, slowly, but not as slowly as you might think, puppet theaters began to appear in all the major cities in what was then the Soviet Union. And so today, the puppet theater is alive and thriving and state funded, and there are puppet theaters in all the major cities, and in cities like Moscow, there's multiple puppetry companies. Some of them continue on with some of the theater for youth, fairy tale style shows, such as those that you might see at the Obraztsov State Central Puppet Theater. And then some return to pre-revolutionary forms like Vagrant Booth, as you saw. And then there are also wonderful experimental theaters like Tien Theater, which means shadow theater. They do these Lilliputton shows, which have tiny theaters. It's a tiny theater with a tiny audience of 2,000 spectators this big, and then 6 live spectators that look through the windows of the theater. Wow. And so the innovations and experimentation are very much continuing. It's really exciting.
I think some questions that people in the West, or in whatever, Europe and the US have to do with the fact that after Bolshevik Revolution, a really innovative aspect of Russian puppetry was the formation of the state puppet theaters on Obraztsov's model. And I think some, people wonder, well, what after the fall of communism, did those huge state theaters, which so much defined Russian puppetry and Eastern European puppetry, did they continue to be funded?
I can't tell you if all of those theaters continue to be funded, but I know that the major theaters that I visited when I was, back in my 20s, going around Russia and looking at puppet theaters, that those major theaters are still there and very much thriving, and that there's really exciting festivals that happen every year, and that there are also a growing number, a really well-established by now number of small performer collectives who do vertep and domestic theater festivals, and a number of puppeteers who do wonderful Swazzled Petrushka performances and
Cool.
tour. So it's a really vibrant scene.
I wanted to get back to the fascinating aspect of your work, which is your interest in I'm going to call it actors theater, and especially the role of the director, but your larger focus on Russian 20th century theater and avant-garde innovations, and the way that puppetry connects. How does puppetry connect to those larger inventions or creations of Russian modern theater?
So I think what I want to do is I want to use that as a segue into talking about Nina Efimova.
Yay.
Yeah, so briefly though, as I mentioned before, but I'll mention in a more succinct fashion now, puppetry was really exciting as a way to discover, the puppet provided a window into the fundamental nature and fundamental laws of puppetry. And there were many theater artists who were interested in finding what was specifically theatrical about theater. I mean, everyone thinks of, or many people, when they think of Russian theater, they think of Stanislavski and the acting system that he's so famous for. And they think of Chekhov, whose plays were first staged at the Moscow Art Theater. But only a handful of years after Chekhov's plays began to be performed, there was a huge debate over what theater's essential nature was. And many artists began to think very quickly after realism and naturalism began to be used as styles in Russia. They began to think very quickly that realism and naturalism were dead ends in terms of artists providing a creative contribution to the theater.
Right.
So there were these debates about what an actor should be, what a theater should be, how you could use theatricality, what theater's fundamental laws were.
Right.
And puppetry became a sort of microcosm to explain and to articulate and to imagine how theater could be more theatrical on a larger scale, right?
That's fascinating. That's so cool.
So one of the central figures in this was Nina Efimova. We'll go to the first slide on her. And I love, love, love this image because this to me really captures her work. Okay, so she, let me give you a little bit of background on her so you understand what this image is. She began as a painter, a visual artist. She studied quite a bit with artists in their studios in Paris. She became very captivated by the Chat Noir and saw the shadow theaters there. She did a lot of domestic theater with children in her home. And then also her mother founded the first preschool in Russia. And so she did, as a teenager, she did Petrushka shows for her mother's students and got very interested in the form that way. She ended up becoming probably, I would say, the greatest Russian puppetry innovator of the first half of the first third of the 20th century, and she pioneered many, many different innovations in form. This is one of my favorites because this is a life-size Petrushka. And the show that she did with this Petrushka was a dance that she staged with Petrushka. And the toes of their shoes are attached and their fingers are intertwined so that when she and Petrushka danced, you couldn't tell who was leading. Was it the material that was leading, the puppet that was leading, or was it the puppeteer? And so this really helps us understand her truly responsive and interactive love of and with materials. All right, we can go back. Let's go to the next slide, actually. She's best known for her book that's translated in English as Adventures of a Russian Puppet Theater. It's the first substantial manual on how to create puppet theater. The first edition was published in 1925 in Russian. If you'll go back to the image of me, I want to show the audience something very special, which this is the, can you see that, John? Can you see that, everyone?
Yes, very well.
Yeah, this is that first edition right here. And it's beautifully illustrated because she was a visual artist with images of herself as a puppeteer.
Right. And
then also with illustrations of her various shows. This is The Hermit and the Bear. It's a fable by Ivan Krylov.
I wanted to, I'm sorry to interrupt. Like,
please.
Because you mentioned the 1935 English edition that was published by Paul McFarlane in Detroit. Yeah. And that's a super interesting aspect of American puppetry history because nothing comes across from Russian puppetry that early. And here you have McFarlane recognizing what Efimova is doing and wanting to translate it and succeeding in translating it and letting a lot of American puppeteers see what was happening in Russia, during the revolution. So super interesting.
It is super interesting. And it really gives her an opportunity to be very influential in both the US and to a lesser degree, the UK and in Russia. Even though she was this, she was immediately after the revolution, she decided that she could no longer just be a visual artist because it didn't feel socially relevant. The world was changing so much. I think we all feel a little bit of that right now. Our world right now is changing so much that what seemed relevant a few months ago no longer feels relevant anymore. So she felt that she had to create art that had a social purpose. And so she started doing her Petrushka shows and her fairy tale shows full time. And had an itinerant theater that traveled around. There were over 1 million street children who were orphaned during World War I and during the Bolshevik Revolution. And so that was a real reason for her to begin doing theater for youth. And she would travel around the countryside and, there was this famine period, food was scarce, people couldn't afford to pay her, but they'd pay her with a bowl of porridge, or they'd pay her with a potato. And I'm so inspired by the fact that she created such beautiful and such meaningful work and such rigorous work, such virtuosic work, and such materially responsive work during that period of upheaval.
How do you mean materially responsive?
So let me show you a couple more slides. And then we'll come back and talk more. Emily, I'd like to go through the next 4 slides and I'll just talk through them. So as you can see, she really thought about how to visually represent her puppets, and she created lots and lots of herself here.
We're getting some glitches with your audio, Dassia.
Oh, okay.
That's better.
How about now? Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, very good. Can we go to the next slide? I just wanted to show folks an image of the traveling theater. But then next slide. But when I say materially responsive, I mean, she thought a lot about the materials that the puppets were made of. And she thought a lot about not what the puppeteer, what movement the puppeteer would impose upon the puppet, but how the puppeteer could find what the puppet wants to do. Next slide.
Oh boy.
And this led to a number of different kinds of innovations. This beautiful single puppet that represented the three witches of Macbeth, where the gauze would float and cast shadows on the theater wall. And then also in the image on the left, you see, if you look closely, you can see that she's got a herd of leaping pigs on her head so that she could come up and, you know, and show the pigs while operating two other puppets at the same time. All right, we can end the slides.
It's interesting because you pointed out that she was doing Petrushka, so like connecting with mainstream Russian puppet folk traditions from quite a century at least, but then doing what we would now call experimental puppetry.
Mm-hmm.
That combination is so fascinating.
Right, some life-size puppets. She also innovated rod puppets that had the rod at the elbow so that the hands could be very expressive. Mm. Her Lady Macbeth had a different profile on either side of her face so that she could change facial expression. So at once experimental and creative, and at the other, you know, at the same time, really thinking about what the materials wanted to do and choosing fabric very carefully for its movement qualities, and working in front of a mirror so that she could see exactly what the puppet was doing.
Did a lot of experimental artists, especially in the 20s, had a difficult or died when Stalin kind of rejected a lot of the avant-garde? Did she ever have a problem dealing with this Soviet culture apparatus at that time, like some others?
So the 1920s were this vivid experimental time where the person who was what we would think of as the minister of culture, what the Soviets called the Commissar of Enlightenment and Education, he was really interested in artistic pluralism, and he was in his position until 1929. And so a lot of that explosion in the 1920s and that variety and that experimentation with form in the 1920s was due to the fact that he wanted to see what artists would do on their own without putting too many restrictions on them. Right. So after he stepped down, a few years after he stepped down in 1934, realism became the only legal style in the Soviet Union. Right. And it was a couple of years after that that, you know, the really famous, the show trials, the purges, the height of the Stalinist terror. And that's when you have people being arrested and tortured and sent to Gulag, or simply unpublished and repressed. So because Efimova's, because most of her work was created between 1916 and the early 1930s, and because she was doing primarily, not exclusively, theater for youth, right. Her career fell at a pretty good time. You don't hear much about her work after the early 1930s, though. Right.
Huh. Okay.
She sort of fades away.
Okay. Okay. I don't want to interrupt your fascinating review of this. Did you want? I wanted to talk about, ask you about puppets and the puppet and the director, but I don't know if you wanted to, if you had more to share about Efimova.
Well, there's just a few more things that I want to say about her, and specifically to connect the puppet and the director. Because the other thing that I find really interesting about Efimova, you could think of her primarily as an author, right? Since she wrote this beautiful book, right? You could think of her primarily as a puppeteer. You could think of her primarily as a visual artist.
Mm-hmm.
But what I think is really interesting and really generative is when we think of her as a director.
Great.
Because it allows us to expand what a director is. Because in the puppet theater, John, as you know, a director is a director, artist, writer, performer, publicist, a spectator. A director, because puppetry is a form that allows for so many perspectives and allows for so many different engagement entry points.
Right.
A director can be a much more expansive thing than we might think of as a director in live actor theater.
Right.
And if you think of Efimova in that way, I think it's really exciting, and you can really start to think about what theatrical principles she had that taking on all of these different aspects of an artist's practice allowed her to innovate. So I already talked about her focus on the material. I talked a little bit about her emphasis on virtuosity. She thought that that a puppeteer had to be like a pianist, and your hands had to be able to do absolutely different things at the same time. And she did a number of different exercises to train herself to do that.
Cool.
Responsive, very much movement-based, beautifully plastic in the sense of movement, choreography, an emphasis on the presence of the artist in the work instead of trying to hide the fact that this is a creative work. And interestingly, the idea that the puppet, that the hand in glove puppetry, that the hand is the puppet's soul. And could we look at the slide for that? Yeah. And you'll see that there's a really interesting genealogy of this. Efimova got this idea of the hand being the soul of the puppet from Georges Sand's book, The Snowman, written in the 1800s. And then Sergei Abratsov was her student. And then Handspring Puppet Company, with their famous logo of the soul springing from the palm of the hand, got it from Abratsov. And so there's this wonderful, multi-century genealogy of this idea that that this close physical proximity is necessary, and that the puppeteer can extend life into the material world.
Right. And the hand is the place where that happens, right? Where the body meets the object.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking, it's so interesting about puppetry and directing, because like Edward Gordon Craig, who's a puppeteer or puppet friendly person, sort of invents the idea of the modern director. And then it's interesting that Efimova is, as you're saying, approaching that too. Did she think of herself as a director? Did she did she think of that job description as something that characterized her?
I'm not sure if she used that word, because she was creating work right when the idea of there being a director in theater at all was still relatively new.
Right.
I think she probably, in contemporary terms, she probably would use the word maker.
Right.
Or, well, Petrushchnika, right? Petrushchnika, this word right here means Petrushkateer, essentially.
Petrushkateer, cool.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's, you and I work in theater departments, and I don't know about you, but for me, you're aware of the fact that when people talk about acting and directing, they're talking about Stanislavski method and Chekhov and that whole side of Russian theater, which is sort of the major influence on so much American acting. But we know that the other side has to do with Meyerhold and a lot of the avant-garde directors that you're talking about, and Efimova, who in my mind were equally important, but oftentimes sort of not thought about so much as influential. And yet for us, because of the fascinating ways you're looking at it, we can see that they are so important for puppetry and for particular types of theater that aren't in the Stanislavski tradition. But you're
Right.
more eloquent about this than
And it's not a binary either, which is really interesting. I mean, Stanislavski, here's you know, I have my shelf of treasured possessions over here.
Altar.
This is a photo from Stanislavski's 1908 production of Maeterlinck's The Bluebird.
Cool.
So with a character that's a cat, right? And Stanislavski, he was really interested in experimenting with theatrical form that could be more poetic, right? But because he was, you know, sort of touted as the example of realism when realism was politicized in the 1930s,
Right.
that early symbolist work, all his experiments with black velvet, for instance, all these abstract shapes in black velvet, that did not become part of the historical narrative, right? And so the idea that that theater can be something that is poetic and responsive, I mean, that's part of Chekhov as well. You think of the breaking string, for instance. You think of these moments in Chekhov that
the
are
cherry orchard.
Yeah, that are not at all trying to show an accurate depiction of what life looked like in 1904.
Or the play within the play and the seagull, the little symbolist play.
Exactly.
I don't know if you want to address Frank Prochen's question about Efimova's audiences, and then we want
I would love to. And there's wonderful comments here as well.
Yeah.
You know, Colette Searle's appreciating the looking at puppetry through directing. But Frank, yes, I would love to address this. So initially, in the early part of her career, when she was still very much an amateur, she performed for children at her mother's preschool. She performed for invited audiences in living room settings. And then her first really public show was, she was invited to perform at a World of Art exhibit in 1916. Then after the revolution, many of her shows for years were itinerant. She would take that booth around and perform for children and peasant audiences and perform in artistic cabarets. She performed for Stanislavski.
Factories too?
Sorry, factories as well. And also she was involved in the founding of the first formal state puppet theater in Russia, and she and her husband Ivan had a theater there where they would perform some Petrushka shows and some shadow shows. The tragedy is that because firewood was so scarce, a number of her shadow puppets ended up being burned. But a really wide variety of spectators. Some shows that were just for adults, such as that early 1930s Macbeth.
Right, and wasn't there one of authors? Was there the banquet of authors?
That's right. Also early 1930s, a series of giant puppets that sat behind a table.
I wondered if we should think about the director's prism, and that's super fascinating for me, because you're talking about these directors who I was trying to think about in terms of their distinction a little bit from Stanislavski, although you pointed out Stanislavski had his symbolist, non-realist side. Meyerhold, Tairov, and Eisenstein, and how they, you put it, used the fantastical tales of German Romantic writer E.T.A. Hoffmann, who influenced a lot of puppet shows, to reinvent the rules of theatrical practice. Is this a good time to think about what they were doing and the relationship of that work to puppetry?
Absolutely. So what I want to do before we look at the slides is I want to draw a couple of connections, sort of philosophical connections between Efimova's work that I think illuminates the work of these directors as well, who are, varyingly known. Meyerhold is often known for his biomechanics, for his constructivist political work. Eisenstein is very well known for his films such as Battleship Potemkin. There's that famous scene where the baby carriage goes down all of those stairs in Odessa. You could think of that baby carriage very much as a performing object, right?
Right.
So if we think back to what Efimova was doing in terms of responsiveness to material and emphasis on creation as a form of life rather than representation as a form of life, and also the multiple perspectives, the sort of inside the fiction, outside the fiction that you saw in the Vagrant Booth interaction between the musician and Petrushka. All of those things became very interesting to Russian experimental directors who really recognized these as elements that were really fundamental to theater, so that theater didn't have to serve something else. Theater didn't have to serve dramatic literature, and theater didn't have to serve daily life. So the question was, what could theater do that no other form could do, right? So let's, I want to just give you a little bit of a taste of how this puppet prism, if you will, really applied to the three directors that I talk about in this book. So we'll go to Meyerhold first, right? And I just had to show you this image of Meyerhold because I love this, again, this double perspective, right? That you could see him from two sides at once. And I think that was really essential to the way he thought about theater in general. So when I think about Meyerhold, I think a lot about his fascination with Fairground. I think about his fascination with Commedia dell'arte, his interest in the mask, his interest in actors as acrobats, as magicians, as puppeteers, his interest in improvisation. And I want to read you a little passage, actually, while you look at this slide. He ran this studio, the Borodinskaya Street studio, from 1913 to 1917. And he used the principles of Commedia dell'arte to train a new kind of actor that could perform in this new kind of theater. So actually, Emily, if we could come back to us, so that folks don't have to stare at the slide for too long. But here is what here are some of the experimental exercises that he had his actors do. He thought of the actor's costume as a decorative adornment, hats as a pretext for a theatrical bow, sticks, lances, rugs, lanterns, shawls, cloaks, weapons, flowers, masks, noses, and like instruments as material for training exercises for the hands. Tulle, you know, that sort of ballet costume material, in the hands of 4 stage servants. Those were sort of visible characters who could manipulate the action, as punctuating accents for the gestures and conversations of the main characters. So he's thinking about space also as a substance that can be manipulated, and objects as tools for responsively training the actors to think about things like rhythm and visual punctuation and expressiveness. And I see a lot of puppetry in that.
Right. Did he? And he wrote about, he sometimes wrote about puppetry specifically, right? Am I wrong about that?
Yeah, he wrote, in 1916, he wrote an essay called The Fairground Booth, and a section of that of the Fairground Booth is called Two Puppet Theaters. And I'm glad you said that, because there's a section I wanted to read you from that as well. This is, again, how he's thinking about, he's using the puppet as a metaphor to think about how theatrical theater is different from representing everyday life, and how the puppet helps us understand that. So he says, when the puppet weeps, the hand holds the handkerchief away from the eyes. When the puppet kills, it stabs its opponent so delicately that the tip of the sword stops short of the breast. When one puppet slaps another, no color comes off the face. When puppet lovers embrace, it is with such care that the spectator observing their caresses from a respectful distance does not think to question his neighbor about the consequences. When man appeared on the stage, why did he submit blindly to the director who wanted to transform the actor into a puppet of the naturalistic school? Man has yet to feel the urge to create the art of man on the stage.
It's also just like Bertolt Brecht is arriving at some very similar perceptions about the theater at the same time, and this is so fascinating.
Yeah, Brecht is a little later, and it's interesting because this is 1913.
Okay,
so pretty earlier.
Got it.
There's an interesting genealogy there because Meyerhold worked very closely with a playwright called Sergei Tretyakov, and then Brecht thought of Tretyakov as his teacher, and interacted quite a bit with Tretyakov when he came to Moscow in the 1930s and saw Milan Fang perform.
Right.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, and yeah. So if we could go back to a slide. So the next slide. All right, so this is the familiar Meyerhold, right? So if people are familiar with the director, they are familiar with the biomechanics, and they are familiar with these constructivist sets. But that earlier work, right, that work from the 19-teens really helps us understand what's going on in this work. How do you make the body a responsive kind of material?
Right.
And how do you use the entire stage environment to have playful interactions and to use sets and doors and ramps in unexpected ways? Emily, if you would go to that one image that I had forgot to put in the slideshow. Yeah, go back one, there you go. This is a famous example of when Meyerhold actually did use puppets. This is 1926. This is the construction of the mannequins for his production of Gogol's The Inspector General. At the very end of the play, all of the actors freeze in horror when they realize that the real Inspector General has finally come to their town and they're all in trouble. So the lights went out, the curtain came down briefly, and then when it went back up, all of the actors had been replaced with life-size mannequins of themselves.
I've never seen an image of that. That's amazing. That's awesome.
Yeah. So that's a good sense, I think, of Meyerhold. Tairov is a little bit different because Tairov, he didn't write as much about puppet theater, but he did incorporate puppet theater more actively into his theater. He founded a theater called the Moscow Kamerny Theater, or Chamber Theater, with his life partner Alisa Konin in 1914. And after Nina Efimova left that first children's theater, that children's theater was absorbed into the Moscow Kamerny Theater. And there was an actor there, Vladimir Sokolov, who sort of headed that puppet studio, and in about 1920 began teaching puppetry as a required class for all the actors in the theater, because it was thought that by learning puppetry you actually could strip away all the noise of an actor's movement and refine your movement to its essential gestures. But I also learned from Boris Galdovsky, who wrote a wonderful article on this, that the Kamerny also, when Tairov as a director was collaborating with the visual artists who were designing the shows, the visual artists would create a model set and tiny figures so that they could tweak the design and rough block the show with puppets first, before then, next slide, bringing the actors in. So you could see how the gestures become exaggerated and yet precise through both the training of the actors in puppet movement, and then also this really careful working out of what gestures and images and stage pictures would be in advance.
Mm. We should, I think our theater department should do that. Actors. Well, I think at Northwestern you do that. The actors and directors have puppet training, and it's seen as a valuable tool.
Mm-hmm. My colleague Jessica Thebus teaches a wonderful toy theater class here, as you know, John, because you've been a guest in that class. And it's a required class of the directors and designers, with that being the very idea that that visual storytelling needs to be precise, both in the specific image and as images move through time. And so directors, you know, they have typically some part of that skill set that they need to work on, and designers have some part of that skill set they need to work on, and it ends every year with a festival that I have to say is the best theater at Northwestern.
Right. And it's sort of reiterating what you were talking about with the Kamerny Theater, with working with a model stage and figuring out blocking.
That's right. So I'll turn to the last director in this book, and that is Sergei Eisenstein. In the book, I look at him before his film work. He began in theater and initially went to film because he wanted to have a 10-minute film piece in one of his stage productions, the same way he wanted to have some circus work in his stage production, and he wanted to have some, you know, tightrope performing and some clown work. Film was seen as another sort of fairground style attraction that could be incorporated into his show. But before that, he was a student of Meyerhold, and before that, he was a very big fan of Meyerhold. And so he was really interested in what he saw in terms of Meyerhold's fascination with the grotesque, with collisions of different styles, different emotions, with fusions of animals and humans and machines and humans. So we'll look at a couple of his early designs in the next slide. All of these designs are from productions that never saw the stage, but that I think really influenced his later film work, because you see the same kinds of distortions, you see the same kinds of combinations of humans and machines. Mm. The one on the left is the automaton from Tales of Hoffmann, Olympia, the famous automaton. And in his imagined production, all of the characters in the entire opera were to be marionettes, except for Olympia, who was to be a mechanical doll. And I just love that he was thinking of staging a marionette production, even if it never saw the stage. And then on the right, he dreamed of staging a pantomime, a commedia dell'arte pantomime with Harlequin and Perrault and Columbine and this love triangle. And Columbine marries the wrong man and has this wedding ball. And the wedding ball featured her parents, but Ma was the banquet table and Pa was the toilet. So that's what you're seeing here, is these object-human combinations where Ma has, you know, soup on one thigh and dispenses sparkling water from a breast. And Pa has a chain that can be pulled to flush the water tank.
Great.
Fascinating, isn't it?
Yeah, it reminds me, like George Gross did some sort of flat cutout puppets in the 20s during the Dada years that remind me of that. Again, I've never seen those images. I've heard about those projects.
Right.
So fascinating. And I was just thinking, there's this famous unfinished film by Eisenstein, Que Viva Mexico, that he shot in Mexico.
That's right.
And when you watch it, you say, wow, this person has an affinity for masks and puppets and object movement. You just know it because of what he's using to look at. So it's wonderful to see you talking about.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. All that early work that he did was very, very physical, very interested. And he really saw himself as a designer, right? As somebody who directed through design. and through playing with and imagining crazy objects, really interesting objects.
Is this a time to talk about Gotzi and
Yeah.
the love for three oranges, or the three loves for three oranges is the way you're looking at this fascinating connection of three different artists to the same story.
Mm-hmm. All right, so so that's a new book, and I'm really excited that I have the opportunity to talk about it because it just went officially into production, past press board approval, and just went officially into production a couple of days ago. It's a collaboration with a musicologist and Prokofiev scholar, Kevin Bartig, who's at Michigan State, and with a graduate student at Northwestern, Maria Di Simone, who is a native Italian speaker and who translated for the first time since 1890 Carlo Gozzi's Fiaba, or fairy tale play, The Love of Three Oranges. So Meyerhold used his reimagining of Gozzi's fairy tale play to launch his Commedia dell'arte studio, the one that I told you about, where actors were playing with hats and gloves and different objects as training material for actors. And working on this project has been a particular pleasure right now because the fairy tale itself is about a prince who's dying of a hypochondria pandemic. And the only thing that can save him is laughter. Mm-hmm. And so to be able to work on a project about laughter right now has been a particular pleasure. And to be able to collaborate with authors across 4 countries and 3 languages has been really, really lovely. So I guess how this is relevant to this conversation is because it gets back to the connections between puppet theater and Commedia dell'arte, right? Mask theater. It again reminds us of the centrality of whimsy and improvisation and experimentation, and of theater that can be based in action rather than based in spoken dialogue. Right. Because Gozzi's version and Meyerhold's rewriting of the Three Oranges fairy tale, both of them contain almost no dialogue. It was Prokofiev who adapted not Gozzi's version, as the story has gone for the last 100 years, but Meyerhold's version. He was the one who developed it into an opera libretto and added dialogue. Okay, cool. And is your book looking at, well, the production, specific productions like by Gozzi in the 18th century, and then the Meyerhold and then the Prokofiev, and examining the materiality of those? Well, for all the puppeteers out there who are looking for really good material to stage, the Meyerhold has never been staged. It has yet to receive, more than 100 years in, it has yet to receive its world premiere. And so we can't talk about productions of that, but what we can talk about is the formal innovations of it, how it provides insight to Meyerhold's larger theatrical practice, what the state of Commedia dell'arte was in Russia at the time, how this earlier work connects to the post-revolutionary work, and then what the relationship was between Meyerhold and Prokofiev that then led to the creation of the opera. But the book does talk about about 2 really key stagings of the opera. The world premiere that took place in 1921, that's the reason why we're doing this book now, is so that it can come out in 2021 to celebrate the world premiere in Chicago that will have happened 100 years before. And then we also talk about the Gozzi in the context of the company of actors that he collaborated with. Nice. Also his other theatrical work, his views on improvisation, and new discoveries in the Gozzi archive in Venice. Amazing. And there's translations of each of the 3 dramatic pieces, and we worked very closely. So it's the first time that these dramatic pieces that are so intertwined have been translated alongside each other.
I'm not sure you have images of these that you wanted to share.
Oh yeah,
there we go.
yeah, let me just show you. So what you're looking at here, the one in the center is Boris Annefeld's design for the opening prologue, where there are all these warring choruses of opera styles and fans, and then onstage spectators who are looking in at the action. So you see this sort of inside-outside self-referential thing that we've been talking about. That's the design from that Chicago world premiere in 1921 of the opera. The image on the left is the company of actors led by Antonio Sacchi that Gozzi collaborated with. Sacchi is also famous as the Truffaldino who first performed in Goldoni's Servant of Two Masters. So that's the same actor, for those of you who are interested in some of those plays. And then the image all the way on the right is the cover of Meyerhold's journal. Because he had a studio, he created this dramatic adaptation. And then he also had a journal that he called Love for Three Oranges, the Journal of Dr. Dappertutto. And that's where I got the studio notes that described what kind of training he was doing with his actors. But it also has, wonderful play translations. There's a great Russian translation of Tieck's Puss in Boots, for instance.
Wow.
Yeah.
And I need to add that our namesake, Frank Ballard, did a production of Love for Three Oranges with rod puppets and in some cases life-size puppets that I realize now is based on the Prokofiev, because he loved music, which now I realize from you was also based on the Meyerhold.
That's right.
Going back to Gozzi. That's
right.
cool. Now we have like 20 minutes remaining, more or less. Carol asks if Ballard was influenced by Meyerhold's love of Three Oranges. And I want to say I don't think so, but not 100% sure. I don't know if Dassia knows. You wouldn't know.
I think Frank Ballard would have had to have done a fair bit of research or had some serendipitous encounters in order to know about the Three Oranges, Three Oranges images.
Because people don't know about that.
Because it's a lesser known part of the story.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question though.
Yeah, fascinating. And we should do another exhibition of that. I wanted to think about kind of step back and think about this Routledge Companion to Puppetry and Material Performance. But I noticed that Colette had a comment that maybe you've addressed already. She says, I'm curious about Dassia's thoughts on the relationship between realism as a political tool in Russia and the rise of American realism in the theater training, via Stanislavski's approaches to acting. Is that what you like?
It's a really good question. And this is something that I really want to do more research on in the future, since I learned that Lee Strasberg's papers are at the Library of Congress. They're being processed. But here's my hunch. My hunch is that because so many Americans who were using Stanislavski in the 1930s and 40s were also had communist or socialist leanings.
Right.
And they didn't yet know that Stalin was implementing so much terror.
Right.
I do think that there was a sense in American theater culture that to be politically true, you also should be using the style that the Soviets were saying was the style that was most politically valuable. And
right.
I think, therefore, very much that one of the reasons, there are other reasons, but that one of the reasons that realism has been such a dominant style in the United States is actually due to some of this Stalinist residue.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you study the group theater or you read the group theater books. I mean, you realize they were all they were all leftist, or if I'm exaggerating maybe, but they all had a sense of very progressive, one could say, you know, radical ideas about the nature of their theater. And sometimes I think that cultural aspect or political aspect of Stanislavski method in the group theater sort of got separated. The other thing I wanted to mention is that our friend, the late Bernice Silver, who died at the age of 104 or 106 earlier, she told me about how she studied acting with the group theater in the 30s in New York, and and she said, well, we studied Stanislavski style, but for her that meant more of what you're talking about in terms of Meyerholt and Tairov, that they did sort of gesture-based, non-realistic group movements. And that for her was Stanislavski method. So I guess that means there was some subtlety. That's sort of the limit of my insight to that.
Yeah.
Okay. I wanted to step back and think about a project that you and I were involved with with Claudia Orenstein, the Rutledge Companion to Puppetry and Material Performance. You were a major organizer of that, and your writing in that is really insightful, especially your introductory writing. But I wondered how that work and how that book may have influenced your thinking about puppetry studies, or maybe you know, you have thoughts about the influence of that book, if any.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I was actually working on both of these books simultaneously. So this was my sort of love project. And at the time, this felt like my tenure book, because it's always harder to complete a monograph than it is to do collaborative work, at least for me. I really love the collaborative work. And so for me, I think the biggest that, you know, thinking alongside these wonderful 28 authors, some of whom are with us today, Colette, you know, at the very least, I know is listening today. Thinking alongside these wonderful authors and hearing their extremely articulate insights that captured things that I had thought in a much more muddy way, in some cases about how puppets function, and allowing me to hone that and crystallize that was really, really valuable, especially in terms of thinking of the centrality of material and the relinquishing of control that puppetry actually allows, in contrast with a more common metaphor, and the dualities of puppet theater, that a puppet can be alive and dead, and it can be fiction and reality, and it can be, you can weep and laugh at the same time. That to me was absolutely essential to my thinking on these Russian directors, because Meyerholt in particular was also interested in laughing and weeping, and in horror and pleasure, right, and in something that is rapid and slow at the same time. And so it helped me understand how similar kinds of dualities can function in theater with live actors as well.
I appreciated the way you helped shape that book to include sort of the wide range of puppetry studies that I think is in part of what we're looking at now, and what we've been looking at with these forums all summer, like that range from traditional puppet theater with religious and ritual roots to avant-garde experiments. I know you have some images about your teaching. I don't mean to give short shrift to our Rutledge Companion, but that would be fascinating to look at.
So these are my amazing students who are flying pterodactyl puppets on the Lake Phil at Northwestern. And I'll go to talking about some of the other images in a second, but first John and I will talk, I think, for a sec Emily. So what I love about theater history is through the puppetry prism is discovering that history also is something that we respond to. It's not just something that gets passed down to us, and it's not something that we impose our will or impose our view on. It's something to be discovered and interacted with. And so when I began teaching puppetry at Northwestern 9 years ago, I wanted to think about how I could take ideas that we were reading about and give the students an opportunity to really experiment with those ideas in a hands-on way. Cool. So it's a theater history class, but it has a studio hour every week, and it has a final project. That was one of the final projects that the students created one year, is to fly these pterodactyls.
Cool.
And let's go back to the slides. So one of those mini projects, right, is when we talk about the puppet and the life-death of the puppet, which Penny Francis talks about and Margaret Williams talks about in her wonderful piece in the Rutledge Companion. And Basil Jones also from Handspring Puppet Company talks about how the job of the work of the puppet is to live, right? And that the life of the puppet is a sort of an narrative. So one of the things we do then is we think about how puppet life is constructed and the effect on the audience of taking that puppet life away. So we look at the Perrault, Philippe Gentil's Perrault, where Perrault breaks all his own strings until he's dead. We look at Nada Théâtre's Uberoi, where all of the courtiers are vegetables and get hacked up by the live actor Ma and Pa Ubu. And we look at Old Trout's famous puppet death scenes to understand how life is established and the different ways in which life can be taken away in a way that's effective for the audience. So you establish the life, you establish the threat, you decide if you want there to be suspense or surprise, and then you decide how you're going to show that the puppet's no longer alive. And the things that the students come up with are absolutely glorious.
Oh, great.
You know, like a burning candle puppet, or an unraveling finger knitting puppet, or puppets that get hacked apart by scissors. It's always something that the students really enjoy.
That sounds great.
Yeah. If we could go to the next slide. And then what we do is give them also, I give them an opportunity to create either giant puppets or shadow puppets, since those are the two forms that I'm familiar with. And they've learned about Wayan Kulit, they've learned about Royal Dulux, they've learned about Bread and Puppet, they've learned about Julie Taymor's Lion King, and they've learned about Warhorse. And then they have an opportunity to experiment with those different forms and final performances. And they also write research papers so that they're, you know, really gaining an international perspective and moving a lot beyond American puppetry. We do read you, of course, John, on American puppet modernism, but most of the work they look at is international.
And this is a class that's, you were saying, is a theater history class, but you're still doing a lot of whatever studio work there.
That's right. Because I really feel like you can understand history better as an artist if you're touching it and you're playing with it and you're experimenting with it. I don't think that you have to learn the facts first and then apply them creatively. I'm interested in inverting that, where you apply things creatively as a way of learning historical material.
That sounds I'm very excited about that. I want to take the class. No, I think that's really that's thought-provoking. That's really cool. I wanted to, well, first of all, in the minutes remaining, Nancy Staub. Well, no, there was one question about how people can find your can we buy Dassia's books? I'm looking around, especially writings about Efimova. And you don't have a book, I don't think you have a book about Efimova, but, oh no,
No,
it's in.
but I would recommend, I've written about Efimova in a few different places, but the piece that is most directly practical and really articulates her theatrical philosophy and then gives examples of her puppetry training and of her thinking about Petrushka is a chapter in Russian Theater and Practice, which has a chapter dedicated to a number of different Russian directors, and I wrote the one on Efimov. It's a short little piece, pretty easy to find.
And Nancy Staub, to her, the Petrushka clip that you showed, I believe at the beginning, she says, looks very similar to a scene I saw by Salvatore Gatto with Pulcinella, so I guess an Italian performer. Did the company, did the Russian company study with Gatto, or is that a traditional Petrushka style?
It's a traditional Petrushka style. The wonderful thing about Vagrant Booth is the rigor of their research. They looked at a wide variety of traditional scripts. They also looked at, international historical forms. But that scene of Petrushka and the doctor is a very common one on the 19th century Russian fairgrounds.
And it seemed to me also like that style of I was talking about it as choreography and music, like that. I see that very strongly in really good performances of Polichinelle by French companies. And then at the last Chicago festival, I think there was an Italian company doing Pulcinella, and they all have that particular technique. In my mind, it seems to me it's across European hand puppetry. What Carol Sterling asks, what other puppetry related courses can students take at Northwestern?
Well, the two primary ones are the Puppetry History and Performance class that I teach, and Jessica Thebus's Toy Theater class, which is taught at both a graduate and undergraduate level. But I am excited to say that for the first time, Jessica and I are collaborating on a co-taught class this winter that will pair MFA directors and MFA actors to do devised puppetry work inspired by the travel narratives of the Japanese haiku poet Basho.
Did you want to share an image? Was there a clip with Tom Lee that you wanted to share?
maybe we don't have time to share the videos, but I did want to make one last point.
I think you can. We have time.
We do?
If you have time.
Yeah, okay, so I'll make the point first and then I'll let you enjoy the videos. So one of the things that I've been able to do because puppeteers are so amazing and so generous is I've been able to bring a lot of guests into the class. Tom Lee, who among other characters was Topthorn and the Goose in the Broadway production of Warhorse, has come in to teach. He taught a class at Northwestern at my invitation, and he's also come in to give a variety of workshops. His specialty, in addition to his own work that he does in other people's shows and the work he does with the Chicago Puppet Lab and his work as a director, is as a kuruma ninyo performer. That's Japanese cart puppetry. It's a single manipulator style where the puppeteer rolls on a cart and manipulates the head and arms and then has the feet attached to the puppeteer's feet. Had Vagrant Booth come to Chicago for a residency, and then since then they've made a wonderful video of their studio for our students to see, even if they can't be there in person. We had Kathy Foley as well. So, and John, you've come as well. So inviting puppeteers who are both practitioners and are also thinking critically about puppets in really interesting ways. But I'm going to give a shout out to this as something that could be really useful for folks who are teaching puppetry right now, because puppetry is such a rich international form, and it actually lends itself, I think, really well to being filmed. It's a great thing for folks to invite other puppeteers to come in and speak in their classes and enrich their classes, even if they can't be physically present. So I think we wanted to see just a little bit more of Vagrant Booth. This is the video that they made, a little tiny segment of the video that they made in their theater in Moscow for my class.
Ну вот и Петрушка. Hello, dear friends. Он Петрушка, он говорит, я Петрушка. From Moscow. Ну, скажи что-нибудь еще по-английски, все слова, которые знаешь, говори. Все, давай, все слова.
Я забыл.
Ну как? How do you do? Еще раз. How? Вот. How do you do? Спой по-английски что-нибудь.
Sing something in English.
Sing song
Say.
по-английски.
Я не знаю.
Ну как? Happy birthday to you. Ну не знаю, ну сделай что-нибудь.
Patricia's saying that he's shy.
По-английски, пой, по-английски. Хорошо.
So that's one example. And then for those of you who aren't familiar with Tom Lee's beautiful work, I think, you know, to conclude this conversation, you know, which has mainly been about Russian innovators, the thing I love most about Tom Lee's beautiful work and his collaboration with Japanese puppeteer and sensei Koryu Nishikawa V is the way in which they also do this dance between tradition and innovation, and being respectful of historical traditions while also experimenting at the same time. And I want to show you just a little tiny clip of their tremendous Shanks Mare, which you should all run to go see if you have the opportunity.
And our friend Claudia Orenstein was a dramaturg on that production.
That's right.
She mentioned.
Right, our co-editor for the Rutledge Companion has done dramaturgy on a couple of his projects.
Wow, that's enticing. I want to see more.
Yeah.
Great.
All right. Any questions, or are we out of time?
Well, you know, we could go on forever. It could be.
We sure could. It's so fun.
I don't know if we've, there have been some interesting comments by Jacek Zuzansky about the development of Stanislavski training in the States. I think we're okay about that. He asked earlier, will we have time for Dassia to elaborate on something she said about material as part of a creative language in contemporary and traditional Russian puppet theater? I sort of thought that sort of was infusing what you're saying, but maybe.
Yeah, but that's a great thing to really emphasize as a closing point, I think. So one story I think of is Nina Efimova, when she was creating her Baba Yaga puppet. She bought fabric for it, and it just didn't move right. And she tried to force the fabric to do what she wanted it to do, but it just wasn't working. So finally she found this old, dirty, but soft and supple rag and washed it and realized that this is what she needed for the movement. And so I think you see a lot of that kind of thing in Russian experimental theater, really thinking about what the object wants to do and thinking about design as also a way of augmenting and heightening actor emotion, or design as an opportunity for actors to remove focus from themselves and to improvise. It's a very material-centric period in Russian theater history where many easel painters initially became designers and created backdrops, but then increasingly the design became dynamic, where you started, you know, along the lines of what Adolf Appia was doing in Switzerland. You started having different levels and stairs that provided different rhythms for the actor's body to move through space, things like that.
Yeah, it makes me think about what you're saying about painters and moving into live performance reminds me of what Theodora Skipetaris was talking about in her own work. So I love the way that certain things are coming together. Yeah, so good. Jacek Suzansky says, thank you for this wonderful interview. And our friend Pupak Tabrizi Adalan from Tehran, who she teaches puppetry at Tehran University. And we both have the pleasure of knowing her.
Right, and we published her very wonderful work in Puppetry International.
Yes.
You know, you and I have also collaborated on that for many years with Andrew Periali and Bonnie Periali.
Thank you for mentioning that. Awesome. And Frank Proshon says, a fitting climax to a wonderful series. Lockdown doesn't have to be completely bad. And thanks, Deborah Hunt from Puerto Rico. Okay, we're getting a lot of thanks. I would like to mention that our next forum, which is really our first fall forum, will be Thursday, September 17th, and that will be with Leslie Ash, who was listening earlier, might be listening now, and it'll be about her new book, Out of the Shadows, the Henson International Puppet Festivals, which is a very exciting book that just came out. And then we're doing our fall Puppet Slam online. Our online Puppet Slam will be Friday, September 25th at 8 o'clock. And actually, for the first time, we're soliciting proposals, because you can do that online. There's a Google form that's posted on our Facebook page, and the deadline for that is September 6th. And also, we're doing an online pageant. We normally do oftentimes with Serapede, an outdoor pageant with the community in the town square in front of our museum. This year it's going to be online. It's going to be about the centennial of women's suffrage. So different scenes about women's suffrage. Check on our Facebook page for information about that. And the deadline for registering for that is September 1st. And that's also the deadline for the Puppet Slam. Okay. No. Okay, I'm reading text messages from my friend. Okay. Thanks to everybody. Thanks, Brad Brewer, for checking in. Everybody, Dassia, it's been a great pleasure. I'm reminded. Well, for a while you were our colleague at UConn, and every time I've had the pleasure of collaborating with you, going back to puppet collaborations in the previous century.
Yes.
It's been a great pleasure. So thank you. Best wishes to you, and thanks for your wonderful work.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and it was a wonderful conversation. And thank you to Emily behind the scenes for making all the tech work.
I should add, I forgot to add, that all of these forum presentations are available in recorded form on our Facebook page. And then also, we're accepting donations. If you'd like to support this work and make a contribution to the Ballard Institute and the Museum of Puppetry, please do so. I believe the information for that, the URL for that is going to be posted. So thank you for your support. So I look forward to seeing more about your work, Dassia, and all great things. So
thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Hope you'll continue to take part in our events as they continue in the fall. Best wishes. Thank you. Thanks, Emily.